This video is brought to you by Squarespace because I'm really picky about who I work with, and Squarespace is great. In fact, I've been using and recommending them since 2014 because life is too short to be futzing around with style sheets, HTML, or trying to be a brilliant web designer. To paraphrase Bones McCoy, and don't tell me you prefer Star Wars to Star Trek. I'm a writer, photographer, filmmaker, and YouTuber, damn it, not a web developer. Yeah, he'd never say that. Hold that thought. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and today let's talk about Panasonic's Lumix S Twins, the S1 and S1R, one of which, the S1, I had in hand just a week ago. I think this is actually quite simple. Subject to extended testing, where we find the gotchas, the teething pains, and the wrong assumptions inherent to any brand new camera release. It's clear to me that with the S1 and S1R, Panasonic is out to topple the world order of full-frame mirrorless cameras. It's a Game of Thrones moment, with new alliances challenging the old warriors challenging the new, family feuds maybe, fire-breathing dragons, dragon slayers, really cold, crappy weather.
We can hold them off.
Let's get into it. First, having had one in hand during Photokina. This is it. This is the single most interesting camera in all of Photokina 2018. And then picking up one again last week to confirm my initial impression. It's clear that the Lumix S looks, feels, and operates like a killer camera that ought to give every manufacturer, including Sony, but especially Canon, to a lesser extent Nikon, and Olympus, indigestion.
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
At least. It feels like the premium product its specs suggest, though it's not much bigger, interestingly enough, than the GH5 and especially the G9 from whence it is derived. From the ergos to the build quality to the obvious attention they paid to the needs of actual practitioners, hybrid shooters, and dedicated photographers alike. And a newly refreshed menu system. Panasonic has really laid bare the ergonomic, operational, and functional shortcomings of every one of its competitors. A take no prisoners moment. As well as their competitors' willingness or ability to address them. In my experience, only Fujifilm, Leica, and Hasselblad have recently demonstrated a similar commitment to the shooting experience, the daring to embrace a different industrial design language, and the courage to put everything they can into their cameras. When it comes to lenses, right now only Sony has the from the ground up, short flange distance, native mirrorless full frame lens catalog to challenge Panasonic's hit the ground running alliance with Leica and their three lenses. Hold that thought. With internal 10-bit 422 4K up to 30 frames per second. 60 frames per second external via full-size HDMI port, yay. Dual card slots, SD and XQD, built-in intervalometer, -6 EV autofocusing at f1.4, -3 where contrast is low. 6 stops of IBIS, which is a first in full-frame system. Spectacular 7.5 million dot EVF, best I've ever seen, and more, like weather sealing, handheld pixel shifting with the ability to compensate for motion blurs of the subject, purportedly triple the battery life of a GH5, lighted back buttons, a card door lock, so you don't accidentally pull out a card while the camera is still turned on. Thank you for saving me from myself. I mean that sincerely. The new Lumix Pro support initiative. I mean, the list really is just too long to get everything else in here. No other full-frame hybrid mirrorless camera can touch it. Save for just one thing, maybe two or three. Hold that thought. Although, actually, no, let's not hold that thought. Let's address it. The one thing, the one overarching thing, the one obvious overarching thing that remains to be seen is whether or not Panasonic's continuing commitment to contrast detect-only autofocus gets the S-bodies close enough to Sony's, Canon's, and Fujifilm's, you heard that right, autofocus performance, so that AF is no longer an issue. Yes, they boast new sensors, a new processor, a renewed emphasis on artificial intelligence and speed, just like Sony and Olympus over the past week or two. They were talking about deep learning in the G9 when it first came out, but is all of it enough? The second thing, I'm feeling a bit like a scene in Analyze This, since I didn't see any information on it, I didn't have the opportunity to test it myself, is How good is the S-Twin's sensor and processor performance beyond AF, like high ISO, dynamic range, color science, and buffer speed? I mean, I'm hoping it will be close. They're all full frame. I don't expect it to be superior. I'd love to be wrong in the right direction. I'd tell you right now that I don't think the S-Series autofocus performance will be good enough to eliminate doubts, because I know how the GH5 and G9 autofocus compare to our own Sony a6300, even with the latest firmware updates, Canon's dual pixel AF generally, and Nikon's Z7 specifically, and of course the Sony's, legions of them, especially in video. I mean, we were blown away by the 5.0 beta firmware on the hybrid phase and contrast detect Sony A9 that we had in hand and shot in San Diego just 2 weeks ago. But there are 4 things, I guess, keeping me from doing so at this point. One, the A7 III and A7R III are not going to get the A9's real-time AF tracking and IAF updates. I think this is probably a function of the processors in them compared to that in the A9, and the A9 processor architecture, if not the identical processor, in the A6400. 2, in the test of that A9 beta firmware that knocked our socks off, light was low and contrast was sometimes low, which are where phase detection really holds an advantage over contrast detection. But the question becomes, how often will this particular use case be important to you? And how strong is Panasonic's -3 EV autofocus claim in low light, low contrast lighting? 3, on the other hand, contrast detect systems don't suffer from the kind of banding issues that phase detection systems can because of how the phase pixels are arrayed. This kind of problem has been noted by other reviewers in both the Z7 and the A7R III. But again, this raises the question, how likely will this particular scenario be in your case? Because we never got either camera to that point. 4, as I said earlier, I simply haven't been able to shoot with the S and conduct my own tests. So I don't know how well the IAF and tracking autofocus will perform, though I can tell you in the demo we saw at Panasonic HQ that it seemed to operate very similarly to Sony's 5.0 beta firmware, switching from object to face to eye as the frame and subject permitted. The S-Twin's autofocus performance might already be as good or better than the Z's. It might be all that at least some of us need in the real world. Again, we'll see. Second, Panasonic is not giving the S away, except, depending on your point of view, maybe it is. Let's start with the bodies. We'll get to the lenses in a little bit. So, yeah, at $2,500, the 24.2 megapixel S1 is $500 more expensive than the A7 III and the Z6. At $3,700, the 47.5 megapixel S1R is $500 more than the A7R III and $300 more than the Z7. These are big numbers at that end of the market. But once you experience firsthand the full breadth of everything Panasonic has put into the mix and how good it feels all together, it may well be worth it to you. No need for an Atomos Ninja 5, for example, unless you want to shoot 10-bit 4K at 60 frames per second, and that's more than the difference right there. But maybe not, which is fine. More worrying than for Sony or Nikon, the S1 is only $100 more than Canon's EOS R. This is a big problem for the R because the S1 blows it out of the water. In almost every way, except, of course, if you're heavily invested in Canon glass, need the best and widest selection of super telephoto, prefer the ergonomics and menu systems of Canon, although the R is not quite the same, insist on a true flippy screen, or buying it just for the RF 51.2, which I can see, don't see yourself ponying up for Leica price Leica glass, aren't willing to wait to see what Sigma will have on offer, and legacy Canon glass will do just fine, thank you very much. Or, most importantly, as I just mentioned, require the R's probably superior autofocus. Again, I simply don't know yet what the latest algorithms can do when married to contrast detect AF and newer, faster processors. So, once more with feeling, this is to be determined as a function of actual performance and frequency of the use cases for where those differences matter. Hold that thought for another video, but by the way, since the consensus seems to be that a maximum of only 3 thoughts can be held simultaneously, let's reduce the stack and talk about Squarespace for a moment, starting with those designer templates. They're gorgeous, they're clean, they're super easy to customize. I know because I've been using them since 2014, maybe late 2013, and I'm old enough to remember when quality design like that would cost beaucoup bucks. beaucoup, not bokeh. It's French. Though in French you'd actually say, I think, beaucoup de. I amaze myself what I talk about. Let's talk about customer support, because sometimes in the midst of a deadline, even the simplest things can be overwhelming. And Squarespace makes it easy. Real-time online chat with custom video screen captures of precisely what I have to do on my site is fantastic. I've done it many times before. A picture really is worth 1,000 words in 24 frames per second, at least when it comes to explaining website stuff. Borders on the awesome. Although my 7th grade English teacher, Mr. Lamb, would blanch at the idea of using that word to describe anything less compelling than the Grand Canyon. Bottom line, whether it's a portfolio, blog, swag shop, or more, from marketing tools to analytics, Squarespace frees you to do your business. Okay, back to the S1 for now and its competitors. So specifically, compared to the Canon R, the S does not suffer the R's 4K 1.8x crop. The S has the dual high-speed card slots the R lacks. Ditto IBIS that the R lacks. And given our experience with the Micro Four Thirds GH5 and G9, I expect the S1's IBIS to be class-leading. The S1 has a dramatically more performant EVF than any of them. Same with the R. Ditto, as I said earlier, ergonomics and thoughtful touches, like the backlit buttons, which just tickle me, and that handheld pixel shifting, which I'm looking forward to try. An excellent joystick, better than the A7 III's or the Z6's, dramatically better than the R's haptically challenged multifunction bar, which I really wanted to like. And all of that other stuff I mentioned, and the stuff that you can only imagine because I couldn't get to it a couple of minutes ago. Now, when it comes to the Z series, the Z6 is a more compelling, less compromised, more keenly priced offering than the R to me, with reasonable ergonomics, no crop 4K, and good in-body image stabilization. No, the AF, at least as far as I can tell with the Z7, is not as good as the R's, and it doesn't have the R's flippy screen, but it is close enough as a total package to the A7 III from where I sit to be really interesting, though it suffers from the same paucity of native mount lenses and offers the same legacy glass remediation as the Canon R. Still, I really like the Z7, and I love their 35 1.8. But compared to the Z6, the S1 is still all that and a bag of potato chips. Better ergos, again to me, and reasonable people can disagree. Incontrovertibly, better EVF, better video, better native mount lens selection, better touch interface, better and more small touches. As I said, better IBIS. Now, the current champs, the cameras with the bullseyes on their backs, deservedly so, and that came out wrong, but you know what I mean, are absolutely Sony's A7 III and A7R III. Both are incredible image capture machines, and in the case of the A7 III, incredibly priced. For now, let's talk A7 III. Its AF is essentially a match for Canon's dual pixel autofocus. It's got a 2nd generation IBIS. It's got the obligatory dual card slots and a complete brilliant native mount lens lineup and vibrant third-party lens ecosystem. Its low light performance is class leading, its dynamic range is class leading, its battery life is class leading, its value is beyond doubt. You know the drill. But the EVF is middling. It's fine, though not great for manual focus, and definitely not as good as the one in our GH5 or the G9. There's no flippy screen. Video, while beautiful, is limited to 30 minutes, which is important to us, but not to others. I get that. Bit depth and color space are limited to 8-bit 420, important to others, but not to us. The menu system remains far too complex, and even with the improvements in the ergonomics, the camera remains fiddly. The build quality and feel in hand are sufficient. But if, a big if, as you can tell from the fact that I keep qualifying my comments, the Panasonic comes close on sensor and processor performance in the real world rather than the lab, comes close enough on autofocus performance, again, in the real world of usual use cases rather than the lab, well, you could say that the S1 is a nightmare for Canon and a very uncomfortable reality for Sony and Nikon, even as the S1 is more expensive. I find Panasonic's pricing fascinating. It's assertive. It's confident. But hold that thought. It's also not uninteresting to note that, I'm getting tired of saying this, if the S1 matches the high ISO performance of the current $2,400 A7 S2, which the basic, and there's nothing basic about it, 24 megapixel A7 III does, and matches the A7 S2's autofocus performance, which is more possible because it's not in the same league as the 3rd generation Sony's, The S1 will smoke the A7S II, full stop. While we're at it, let's turn for a moment to Olympus. Olympus comes out with the OMD EM1X with blah, 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 7.5 stops, IBIS, blah, blah, blah. But the overarching eyebrow raiser here is this. The IBIS notwithstanding, it's a $3,000 Micro Four Thirds camera that's actually bigger than the $2,500 no excuses full frame S1 that smokes the Olympus in video and stills image quality. If, well, you know what I was going to say. What about Fujifilm? Well, I think Fuji is one of only 2 camera manufacturers that are okay in all of this, for now, at least in the APS-C world. The X-T3, named Camera of the Year by us and many others, is priced a cool grand less than the S1. Has better autofocus than the Panasonic Micro Four Thirds cameras and the Nikon Zs, has absolutely superb image quality at real-world ISO and enlargements, and 4K video. Brilliant, smaller form factor, well-priced, dedicated APS-C crop coverage lenses, wonderful ergonomics, fantastic film simulations, and IAF and continuous video that even Sony's don't have. And XH1 replacement doesn't seem to be imminent, which means Fujifilm has the time to go for it. Eliminate the 30-minute recording. Make the next generation IBIS even better. Get a flippy screen. Improve battery life, please. Refresh the lens lines, not necessarily for optical performance, but for autofocus, speed, and silence. Rethink their app and menu system, and, well, yeah, that's kind of it. Though actually I am very interested in seeing how their 33mm f1.0 turns out and if that is at the forefront of a new lens direction. Leica is the other camera manufacturer that comes out of this okay, maybe. Again, at least for APS-C. Of course, Leica is the licensor of the L-mount and is Stefan Schultz, Leica product manager for professional systems and Leica lead for the L-mount alliance, told me at Photokina. Leica expects to sell more lenses and bodies as a result of the alliance. Now, make no mistake, Chairman Andreas Kaufmann and his team are very, very smart. I spent time with Dr. Kaufmann a little bit. I know. They also know much more about their own business, as all of these manufacturers do, than I. But the $2,500 S1 does pretty much everything the $6,000 SL does, right down to taking the same lenses, and blows it out of the water on the basis of better video specification, the inclusion of IBIS, the presence of an articulated screen, and an EVF ostensibly superior to the SLs, which had been the best I'd ever seen at 4.4 million dots, their iRes technology, until last week. On the other hand, Leica color is Leica color. Leica industrial design is peerless, Leica heritage is peerless, Leica build quality is peerless, Leica glass is Leica glass, and for some people, only a Leica will do. I understand. Still, with Panasonic committed to releasing 10 L-mount lenses by 2020, and Sigma committed to the alliance as well, it's worth asking, where does Leica go from here? How will it really pan out? What will their relationship do going forward as far as interchangeability of parts? I'm so curious. We haven't gotten to the higher resolution, more expensive S1R yet, but since we're talking lenses, let's turn to glass first. The 3 new Lumix branded lenses Panasonic has announced. There will be no Panasonic Leica branded glass for full frame. Makes sense. Are fascinating in their own right, even if they are now part of an already rich native L-mount lens ecosystem in place that Canon and Nikon will have to replicate from scratch for their new R and Z mount systems. That's because in addition to the, you pick your adjective, superb, gorgeous, stellar, magnificent, ghastly expensive, terribly heavy Leica SL lenses, and whatever Sigma is likely to unveil as their part of the alliance. And one can only suppose this will include many of the same big fast primes and zooms they've already done for full-frame Canon and Nikon bodies, most especially their Art series. Panasonic is moving into uncharted performance and pricing territory for them through their own L-mount glass. I have to tell you that the room up in Newark went quiet when Panasonic unveiled to the press assembled there the $2,300 50mm f1.4 S Pro reference lens. But Panasonic was as direct as I've ever seen a camera manufacturer be. They're aiming to beat not only Sony's $1,500 50mm 1.4 planar, but Zeiss's $4,000 55 1.4 Otis. I mean, that takes some stones. Even if the S Pro 51.4 does have a manual focus clutch, yes. They didn't mention Leica's eye-watering $5,300 Sumilux SL 51.4S spherical, but focus clutch or not, whether it achieves the IQ goals or not, to be determined. It's almost 4 times the price of Nikon's new $600 S-Line 51.8, and the same price as Canon's 51.2. And as I've said, the 51.2 is outstanding. Based on my time with the 50's stablemate, the 35 1.8, I'm guessing the Nikon 51.8 is going to be stellar too. Certainly, that's one of the main premises of the new Z mount and one of the promises of the Z series. What I can tell you from the short time I had it in hand is that the Lumix 51.4, in fact all 3 lenses, felt exceptionally well built, on a par with the best from Sony, Canon, and Nikon. This is also where the nexus of body and lens becomes especially critical, because none of these full-frame standard lenses are image stabilized. Sony's A series, the Nikon Z series, and the S1 can compensate with IBIS. Canon's R cannot. So what do you want to prioritize? Price? One additional stop of light and better bokeh? Or maybe marginally better optics? Or just say even optics married to probably best-in-class IBIS? Panasonic's $1,300 image-stabilized 24-105 f4 is more keenly priced. It's designated an S rather than S Pro lens, thus not part of their premium S Pro line. It's the kind of distinction that Nikon is making as well. It was clear in New Jersey that Panasonic is absolutely gunning for Sony's excellent peer, the $1,400 24-105 f4, which in fact we own, and Canon's $1,100 equivalent. So Panasonic is not giving it away either, though you will be able to buy a camera lens kit, S1 or S1R, where the effective price of the 24-105 drops to $900. And I suspect many people will go that route.
I have very few wants.
Panasonic is not giving away the 3rd lens to be released at launch either, the image-stabilized 70-200 f4 S Pro. Neither Canon nor Nikon had a comparable lens at launch, but the S Pro is 200 more than Sony's 70-200 4. Excellent lens, 300 more than Nikon's AFS Nikkor 70-200 4 GED, and 400 more than Canon's legacy EF 70-200 f4L IS2 USM. It does give one pause. I mean, how much better can it be? And if the Lumix glass is that much better, how does it compare to Leica glass? Interesting. It's not just on the basis of sharpness or micro contrast, physical lens correction, specifically chromatic aberration, on which Panasonic is competing, but also focus breathing and focus shift as you zoom as well. They didn't call these zooms parfocal, so we'll have to see in practice what that really means. But if these differences are significant, videographers will be interested. Now, as I've said before, Panasonic promises 10 new full-frame lenses under the Lumix banner by the end of 2020, and this does include, according to their roadmap, what I can only assume are, they describe them as wide, mid-level, and long constant aperture zooms, their versions of the wholly trendy, whether it's the 11-24, 16-35, and then the 24-70 and 70-200. Maybe 2.8, maybe faster, we'll see. Now let's turn back to the bodies and talk about the $3,700 47.5 megapixel S1R. I'm not quite as sure about the value proposition of the R when compared to the $3,200 A7R III. I think it's more competitive against the Z7. But those are not the only games in town, so hold that thought. Yes, the S1R, again, has superior video and ergonomics. You may disagree, that's fine. But the video in the S1R is more constrained in some ways than it is in the S1, and video is not the primary emphasis of these cameras anyway. Though the S1 does dust the A7R III on video spec. That kind of resolution and the relatively modest burst rates make these cameras more appropriate to architectural, landscape, portrait, and product photography. Thus, the best-in-class, for now, IAF of the A7R III matters, though in our experience, the existing AF performance of Pani's older GH5 and G9 for those scenarios is already fine, as is the Z7's. Sony's IAF is the bomb. You can argue that price plays a bigger role here because there's a $500 price advantage that accrues to the A7R III, combined with its dual card slots and very complete lens lineup, making it a stronger competitor against the S1R than the Z7 with its single card slot, smaller $300 price differential, and its limited native mount 3-lens lineup. Which, on the one hand, again, for the use cases I just laid out are much less important, with a much slower pace than sports or event photography and much more control over the light. These scenarios lend themselves better to adapted legacy glass and reduce the risk of a single card slot failure. I mean, you have time to swap out the card. You'll catch the problem in time. On the other hand, once again, the S1R's handheld and motion blur correcting pixel shifting gives the Panny a significant advantage over both when a tripod is infeasible. Again, the market will let us know shortly how much it values these things. But here's another twist, because you can argue that all of these current models would have been the wrong targets at which Panasonic took aim during product development of the S1 and S1R anyway. That is, you'd have hoped that Panasonic would have assumed a moving target and figured out what was coming next, and next after that. The thing of it is, unless they were clairvoyant, odds are the Panasonic team couldn't know what was coming next, so instead, it appears to me anyway, they threw everything they know how to at the S series, something we see all too rarely, though when we do, like Fuji's X-T3, the market shifts. And those targets, that which come next, suddenly makes, say, the $2,500 price tag of the S1 look spectacular. I mean, a fire-breathing dragon. Short of an internal neutral density filter, for example, what can Sony give us in an A7 S3 that would make it worth, say, the $3,200 launch price we've come to expect? What would justify a $700 premium over the S1? Higher ISO performance? I mean, how many of us regularly use cameras set above ISO 12,800 anyway? 51,200? I mean, even if an A7 S3 comes out that records 10-bit 422 up to 60 frames per second and lifts the recording limit, as they have on the little A6400, and Sony pulls an A7 III style pricing shift and sells it, say, for 2,700, even 2,500, matching the S1, unless it's also got a 24 megapixel sensor and that aforementioned dreamed for internal ND, I still don't think it will be an easy sell against the S1. And of course, it's only a matter of time before there will be the obligatory L-mount adapters for both Canon and Nikon legacy glass, potentially pulling current Canon and Nikon users to Panasonic rather than Sony. It is a necessary component of any conquest sales strategy, that is, the primary tool for growing market share in a declining market. The irony? Sony's strongest hand at the moment, the strongest hand in the entire mirrorless full-frame market, I think, is their lens lineup, derided as a weakness by Canon and Nikon just a few years ago, but now precisely where Canon and Nikon have to build. Because not only do they have the soon-to-be-called legendary G-Master lenses, but they have very economical yet optically excellent 28-2 and 85 1.8. The 50 1.8 doesn't rock me, but you get the point. As I've said before, Sigma's contribution to the L-mount alliance will be a significant factor in its success as well. I don't see those kind of lenses in Panasonic's lens roadmap. Back to the cameras themselves. Maybe version 2 of Canon's R will have IBIS and either a convincing multifunction bar or a great joystick. Maybe version 2 of the Zs will have sorted autofocus and gone to a flippy screen. Maybe they'll all record 10-bit 422 up to 60 frames per second internally. Maybe Sony's A7 III will be absolutely incredible in ways none of us had anticipated. It's all quite possible. But at that point, when and if that happens, I think the S1 will still be competitive. Now, the S1R, think of it this way. A 2019 state-of-the-art 47.5 megapixel full-frame sensor wrapped in a best-in-class IBIS chassis, chunky enough and solid enough to feel fantastic in hand, small enough to be confused with its Micro Four Thirds sibling, the best EVF on the planet for now, and drum roll please, Leica primes. Not like a branded primes, not like a certified primes, Leica primes. Autofocusing Leica primes. Yeah. Who should that worry? I think, actually, Hasselblad and Fuji. Maybe Leica, maybe Phase 1. It depends on the unit volumes and net operating income mix among their bodies and their glass format by format. Fujifilm's don't call it a GFX 100S, GFX 100S with 100 megapixels and the promise of in-body image stabilization is slated to come in for under $10,000, which for now let's call $9,999. At somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 the price, the S1R with Leica glass and the advantage of computational image via pixel shifting, the S1R creates a 180 megabyte file, the S1 a 90 megabyte file. That's suddenly a fascinating alternative. Though I admit the difference in lens prices quickly accrues to Fujifilm's advantage, because if you want IBIS in a medium format camera, it means you're taking it off the tripod, at which point the handling, size, and weight of an S1R based system with Leica glass, with better IBIS and higher frame rates at the same 14-bit color depth, become noteworthy. And If you don't take it off the tripod and manage to add computational imaging to your medium format offering, which is what Hasselblad has done with their H60 400C, well, okay, but how big a market is there for that? And I suspect Hassi will continue to own that. When you think about Panasonic swinging for the bleachers with its own lower price than Leica L-Glass, and again, whatever Sigma puts out there, well then, it's even more fascinating to compare the S1R to the $4,500 GFX 50R, which doesn't have IBIS, nor the S1R's handling, nor its frame rates, nor its top dog EVF, and with lens pricing that may rise above, at least one hopes, some of the Sigma glass, which again, doesn't mean the GFX 50R won't have its fans. I mean, I really like the GFX 50S, for example, love the glass, love Hassi glass too, and I absolutely understand that the difference in perspective, that the longer focal length for a given field of view in medium format is especially pleasing to some. I mean, I know I dug the Hassi 81.8 and the Fujifilm 110 too, and a couple more. Though it is worth noting that some of Platon's most iconic images, shot on old school Hassi 500 ELM film cameras with wide-angle lenses, take their power, at least in part, by being quite distorted. Speaking of which, Hassi's 6500 X1D is the other obvious concern. The X1D is in another class when it comes to industrial design, but again, when you stop to think about it long and hard enough, when you sort through the use cases and what functionality you need, when you realize that both the X1D and the Fuji GFX 50 series share the same 50 megapixel sensor with 14-bit color rather than true 16-bit color of the H60, that is to say, just not that far off today's state-of-the-art 47 plus megapixel full-frame sensors. Well, I'm hoping an X2D is not that far off. Though, of course, just as with Leica, for some only a Hassi will do. Only that medium format perspective will do. And annual model changes do not impress. I get that. Still, while the XCD lens line includes leaf shutter glass for high-speed flash sync, perfect for studio portrait work, as does the Leica S series, still, I think the S1R is a fire-breathing dragon here too, if you reconceptualize the targets. Much to digest, much more to see, much more to be confirmed. Though, it would be nice if that's where the Game of Thrones metaphor ends. I'd really like to see something other than a zero-sum game in the industry. I'd like to see all of the manufacturers I've mentioned here today do well, even the one I still haven't been able to connect with properly. On the other hand, with all of this said, gotchas, teething pains, assumptions or not, the S-twins, like everything else in the history of the world, isn't perfect. That's what evolution is for, ever proving the wisdom of Pareto's paradox. So, no, the S doesn't record intra-frame, for example. There's no RAW, no ProRes RAW. Still 14 bits, as I've said a number of times. No flippy screen, only tilt, very much like the three-way function on the XT3. But, oh well. It doesn't have an internal ND filter, which, as it turns out, the Olympus OMD EM1X doesn't quite really have either. That is a short, minor list. But what the S does have, wow. A quick word about Micro Four Thirds. If you're worrying about the future of Micro Four Thirds, don't. Here at Three Blind Men and an Elephant, we don't plan on selling our kit anytime soon because it does what we need. The size, price, and functional advantages of Micro Four Thirds are so great to us in the real world, especially when you consider lenses. And the image quality and autofocus disadvantage is so small. And I think this is probably true for most people most of the time, that there are simply very few reasons, very few use cases where bigger, heavier, and more expensive makes sense. And all of this gear from every single one of the companies we've discussed today, irrespective of format, will last for years. So just go out and shoot, hone your craft, make your money, or just expand your joy until you really need the marginal benefits of a larger format, and then make a decision. Finally, how many different ways have I said it? How many different ways can I say it? The proverbial proof will be in the pudding. There, a food metaphor. But as of today, February 1st, 2019, I'm calling the S1 twins strong contenders for the 2019 Camera of the Year. And if over the next 11 months something comes along to knock them off that perch, all I can say is, wow, good for us. I can't wait to actually go out and shoot these puppies. That just didn't sound right. This video was brought to you by Squarespace. For all your website needs, be sure to head over to squarespace.com/Hugh for a free trial. And remember to save 10% at checkout by using our discount code HUGH. Thanks, Squarespace.